The blinding whiteout consumed everything in Katherine Taylor's vision as she clutched her hours-old baby tighter to her chest. The worn wagon wheel beside her half buried in snow all that remained of the journey that had ended in disaster when her horse had collapsed and died 2 miles back. Tears froze on her cheeks as little Emma's whimpers grew weaker, the swaddling cloth offering pitifully little protection against the merciless Dakota Territory winter of 1876. "Hush now, little one," Katherine whispered, her voice cracking with exhaustion and fear. "Someone will come. They must come." But her words rang hollow even to her own ears as the wind howled across the vast emptiness stretching between her and Deadwood. She'd been a fool to make this journey in winter, 8 months pregnant and alone, but when news had reached her of her husband's death in a mining accident, she'd had no choice. The banker in Cheyenne had made it clear without Thomas, the house was forfeit. She'd sold everything to make the journey north to her sister's home in Deadwood. But Emma had decided to arrive early, during the worst blizzard in memory. The labor had been mercifully quick under the shelter of a rocky outcropping, but now, with night falling and temperatures plummeting, Katherine knew they wouldn't survive until morning. Her limbs were growing numb, and the desperate urge to close her eyes was becoming overwhelming. The soft crunch of snow beneath hooves barely registered through her fading consciousness. The dark silhouette of a rider materialized through the swirling white, like an apparition from her delirious mind. Katherine tried to call out, but her voice emerged as nothing more than a rasp. The rider dismounted in one fluid motion, his tall frame moving swiftly toward her. "Madam, good Lord, what are you doing out here?" Katherine tried to respond, but her frozen lips refused to form words. Instead, she shifted her arms slightly, revealing the tiny bundle against her chest. The stranger's eyes widened beneath the brim of his snow-dusted hat. "A baby," he breathed, immediately shrugging off his heavy coat and wrapping it around her shoulders. "My cabin's not far. Can you stand?" She attempted to rise but collapsed back against the broken wagon wheel, her strength completely spent. "I've got you," he murmured, gathering her and the infant into his arms with surprising gentleness for such a large man. He whistled for his horse, who obediently came close enough for him to drape Katherine across the saddle before mounting behind her, one strong arm securing her and the baby against his chest. "Name's Henry Xavier," he said, his deep voice rumbling against her back as he guided the horse through the blinding snow. "Most folks just call me Hank." Through her haze, Katherine noticed his careful movements, how he sheltered the baby with his body as they rode. When a small log cabin finally emerged from the white emptiness, she nearly wept with relief. Inside, Henry moved with efficient purpose. He laid Katherine on a narrow bed, built up the fire in the stone hearth to a roaring blaze, and filled a kettle with snow to melt for water. His large hands looked out of place as he carefully examined the infant. "Your little one seems all right, just cold," he said, his voice softer than she would have expected from a man with such weathered features. "How old?" "Hours," Katherine managed through chattering teeth. "Born today." His expression shifted to one of astonishment, then determination. He moved through the cabin, gathering furs and blankets, arranging them near the hearth. With gentle hands, he helped Katherine and the baby settle on the makeshift pallet. He knelt beside her, building a small semicircle of stones around them to reflect the fire's heat more efficiently. The flames cast dancing shadows across his face, a face lined by sun and wind, but with kind eyes the color of a summer sky. "Stay close to the fire," he instructed, his voice low and reassuring. "Both of you." As warmth slowly returned to her limbs, Katherine studied her rescuer. He moved about the cabin with the ease of long familiarity, his tall frame ducking beneath the low beams. His dark hair was streaked with a few strands of silver at the temples, and a scar ran along his jaw, disappearing into the stubble on his chin. "Thank you," Katherine whispered as he handed her a cup of hot broth. "We would have died out there." Henry nodded, his eyes drifting to the tiny bundle in her arms. "What's her name?" "Emma," Katherine replied, looking down at her daughter's pink face. The baby's color had improved dramatically in the warmth of the cabin. "Emma Rose Taylor." "And you are Katherine Taylor." "I was heading to Deadwood." Henry's brow furrowed. "That's still 15 miles north, madam. In this weather it might as well be 100. Katherine closed her eyes briefly. "My sister lives there. I have nowhere else to go." "Well, Mrs. Taylor, you and little Emma are welcome to stay until the storm passes and you're strong enough to travel." He stooped to add another log to the fire. "Storm like this could last days." "I don't want to impose." "You're not imposing when the alternative is freezing to death," he interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. "Besides, I've been out here alone long enough that some company might do me good." As if on cue, Emma began to fuss, her tiny face scrunching up as she sought her mother's milk. Katherine shifted uncomfortably, acutely aware of the stranger's presence. Sensing her discomfort, Henry stood. "I'll see to the horse and bring in more firewood. Take your time." The door closed behind him, and Katherine exhaled in relief. She adjusted her clothing to feed Emma, marveling at the infant's determined hunger despite their ordeal. Through the small window, she could see Henry leading his horse to a lean-to stable attached to the cabin, snow swirling around his broad shoulders. He was nothing like Thomas, who had been slight of build and bookish. This man's hands were calloused from hard work, his movements deliberate and steady. A rifle hung by the door, and a worn saddle rested on a stand in the corner. Everything about the cabin spoke of isolation and self-reliance. By the time Henry returned, arms laden with split wood, Katherine had finished nursing and had rearranged her clothing. Emma slept peacefully against her chest. "How long have you lived out here?" she asked as he stacked the logs neatly beside the hearth. "Going on 3 years now," he replied, brushing snow from his sleeves. "Came out after the war. Needed some quiet." The way he said it told Katherine there was more to the story, but she didn't press. Everyone who came west had stories they'd rather leave behind. "I have some stew left from earlier," Henry offered. "Nothing fancy, but it's hot." "That would be wonderful," Katherine replied, suddenly aware of how hungry she was. As Henry moved about preparing the meal, Katherine noticed how he kept glancing at Emma with a mixture of curiosity and something else, perhaps longing. There was a gentleness to this rough-hewn man that intrigued her. "Have you been to Deadwood?" she asked, accepting the bowl of stew he offered. Henry nodded. "A few times for supplies. It's grown since they found gold in the hills. Rough place. Not many families." He hesitated. "Your sister, she expecting you?" "I sent a letter before I left Cheyenne, but I don't know if it arrived." Katherine sighed, taking a spoonful of the surprisingly flavorful stew. "My husband died in a mining accident 2 months ago. The bank took everything." Henry's eyes softened with understanding. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Taylor." "Katherine," she corrected him. "After what you've done for us, I think we're beyond formalities." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Katherine, then." They ate in comfortable silence, the crackling of the fire and the howling wind outside the only sounds. After dinner, Henry insisted she take the bed while he would sleep on a bedroll by the fire. "I'm used to rougher accommodations than this," he assured her when she protested. That night, as Katherine drifted to sleep with Emma nestled securely beside her, she found herself wondering about the solitary cowboy who had saved their lives. There was a story behind those sky-blue eyes, a story she found herself unexpectedly eager to learn. The blizzard raged for 3 days, confining them to the small cabin. In that time, Katherine learned that Henry had fought for the Union in the war, had drifted west afterward, and had worked as everything from a ranch hand to a guide before deciding to stake his own claim in the hills. "Not for gold," he explained as they sat by the fire on the second evening. "Just a place of my own. The gold seekers can have Deadwood. I prefer the quiet. Don't you get lonely?" Katherine asked, watching as he whittled a small wooden horse, his large hands surprisingly dexterous with the small knife. Henry was quiet for a long moment. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but people have a way of disappointing you. Land doesn't. Not all people," Katherine said softly. He looked up, meeting her eyes. "No," he agreed. "Not all." By the third day, Emma had begun to fuss more frequently. Katherine paced the small cabin, bouncing the infant gently, but nothing seemed to soothe her. "Something's wrong," she said, worry etching lines on her forehead. "She feels too warm." Henry immediately set aside the harness he was mending and crossed to them. With a gentleness that belied his size, he touched the back of his hand to Emma's forehead. "She does have a fever," he confirmed, his expression grave. "Could be anything. Birth is hard on little ones." "What do we do?" Katherine asked, panic rising in her throat. "We're miles from a doctor." Henry's brow furrowed in thought. "I have some willow bark. My mother used to make a tea from it for fevers, but for one so small—" He hesitated. "I wouldn't know the proper amount." "My sister is a midwife," Katherine said, desperation in her voice. "She would know what to do." Henry moved to the window, pushing aside the hide covering to peer out at the snow-covered landscape. The storm had subsided somewhat, leaving behind drifts taller than a man in some places. "Trail to Deadwood will be near impassable," he said, but there was a note of determination in his voice. "But I could try." "No," Katherine said firmly. "You could die out there." Henry turned to face her. "And what would you have me do? Sit here while your daughter's fever worsens?" The intensity in his eyes caught Katherine off guard. This man, who barely knew them, was willing to risk his life for her child. She swallowed hard against the lump forming in her throat. "There has to be another way," she insisted. Henry thought for a moment. "There's an old Lakota woman who lives about 3 miles east. White Feather. She knows medicines that work when nothing else will, if I can reach her." Katherine looked down at Emma's flushed face. The baby's breathing seemed more labored now, her tiny body radiating heat. "Please," she whispered, looking back up at Henry. "If you think she can help." He nodded once, decision made. "I'll prepare the cabin before I go. You'll have enough firewood and water to last until I return." As he gathered his warmest clothing and checked his rifle, Katherine watched him with a mixture of fear and gratitude. "Be careful," she said as he prepared to leave. "Please." Henry paused at the door, his eyes meeting hers. "I'll come back with help," he promised. "Keep her cool as best you can. Dampen a cloth with snow water." After he left, the cabin seemed impossibly quiet. Katherine followed his instructions, gently bathing Emma's hot skin with cool cloths, whispering prayers and reassurances to her daughter as the hours passed. Outside, the wind picked up again, and Katherine's worry for Henry grew alongside her fear for Emma. Night fell, and still he hadn't returned. She kept the fire burning, adding logs as Henry had shown her, the dancing flames her only company as she maintained her vigil. It was well past midnight when the door finally flew open, bringing a gust of cold air and swirling snowflakes. Henry stomped in, followed by a small, elderly woman bundled in furs. White Feather moved with surprising quickness for her age, immediately approaching Katherine and the baby without a word of greeting, her dark eyes, sharp and clear despite her years, assessed Emma with a single glance. She spoke to Henry in Lakota, her hands already reaching for the leather pouch at her waist. "She needs to examine the child," Henry translated, his face etched with exhaustion from the journey. Katherine nodded, carefully handing Emma to the old woman. White Feather's weathered hands moved with practiced precision, checking the baby's pulse, peering into her eyes and mouth, feeling her tiny abdomen. She spoke again to Henry, who listened intently. "She says Emma has a stomach sickness," he explained. "Not uncommon in newborns, but dangerous without treatment." White Feather had already begun to work, mixing herbs from various pouches into a small clay bowl. She added water from the kettle, stirring the mixture with her finger while chanting softly. "Will it help?" Katherine asked, watching anxiously. Henry nodded. "White Feather has saved many children with her medicines, my own sister's son included." The old woman dipped her smallest finger into the mixture and gently placed a drop on Emma's tongue. The baby's face scrunched at the taste, but she didn't cry. White Feather nodded approvingly and prepared a small pouch of the herbs, demonstrating to Katherine how much to mix with water and how often to give it to Emma. "She says by morning, the fever should break," Henry translated. "But Emma will need the medicine for 3 more days." White Feather spoke again, longer this time, her eyes moving between Katherine and Henry. "What did she say?" Katherine asked when Henry didn't immediately translate. A flush crept up his neck. "She says—" He hesitated. "She says Emma is strong like her mother, and that she senses good spirits in this cabin." Katherine suspected there was more to the old woman's words, but she didn't press. Her attention was drawn back to Emma, who already seemed to be resting more peacefully. White Feather refused Katherine's offers of food or rest, insisting through Henry's translation that she must return to her own home. Before leaving, she placed a weathered hand on Katherine's cheek and spoke directly to her, though Katherine couldn't understand the words. "She says you have found what you were seeking, though you didn't know you were looking for it," Henry translated, his voice uncommonly soft. After the old woman left, with Henry promising to check on her the next day, Katherine found herself alone again with the cowboy who had now saved her daughter's life as well as her own. "Thank you," she said simply, the words entirely inadequate for what she felt. Henry shrugged, removing his snow-covered coat. "White Feather is the one with the healing knowledge. But you're the one who brought her here," Katherine insisted. "Through a blizzard in the dark, you risked your life for us. Again." He met her gaze then, something unguarded in his expression. "Some things are worth the risk." The quiet intensity of his words hung in the air between them. Katherine felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt something other than grief and fear, something unexpected and fragile, like the first green shoot after a hard winter. Over the next few days, Emma's condition improved dramatically. The fever broke by morning, just as White Feather had predicted, and the baby's appetite returned with vigor. Katherine found herself smiling more, the crushing weight of her circumstances temporarily lifted by her daughter's recovery and the simple rhythm of life in the cabin. Henry continued his daily chores, chopping wood, tending to his horse, making repairs to the cabin, but Katherine noticed how his eyes would often seek out Emma, how his stern features would soften when the baby grasped his finger or made a cooing sound. "You're good with her," Katherine observed one evening as Henry held Emma while Katherine prepared a simple meal from their dwindling supplies. He looked almost embarrassed by the compliment. "Had 4 younger siblings," he explained. "Someone had to mind them while Ma worked. And your father—" A shadow crossed his face. "Killed at Antietam. I was 16. Katherine's heart ached for the boy he had been, thrust into manhood by war and loss. I'm sorry." Henry shrugged, but the casual gesture didn't match the pain in his eyes. It was a long time ago. "Some wounds never fully heal," Katherine said softly, thinking of her own losses. He looked at her then, really looked at her, as though seeing beyond the surface for the first time. "No," he agreed. "They don't." The weather improved enough by the end of the week that they could finally discuss Katherine's journey to Deadwood. The trail would still be difficult, but passable with Henry's sturdy horse and his knowledge of the terrain. "We should leave tomorrow if the clear weather holds," Henry said as they ate their evening meal. "Your sister must be worried sick." Katherine nodded, though she felt a surprising reluctance at the prospect of leaving the cabin that had become a sanctuary. "Yes, I'm sure Clara is frantic by now." Henry seemed to hesitate before speaking again. "What will you do in Deadwood? It's not the most suitable place for a woman alone with a child." "Clara and her husband have a small boarding house," Katherine explained. "I'll help with the work until I can find something more permanent. Perhaps teach. I was a schoolteacher before I married Thomas." Henry nodded, his eyes on the fire. "Deadwood could use a proper school, too many children running wild in the streets." "And you?" Katherine asked. "Will you stay out here alone?" "It's my home," he replied simply, but something in his voice had changed, a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. That night, as Katherine nursed Emma by the fire, she found herself studying Henry's profile as he cleaned his rifle. The flickering light emphasized the strong line of his jaw, the small scar near his temple, the creases at the corners of his eyes that deepened when he smiled, which, she had noticed, happened more frequently now than when they'd first arrived. She'd been a respectable widow for barely 2 months. It was improper, indecent, even to be noticing such things about a man she barely knew, and yet in this cabin, miles from civilization, conventional rules seemed as distant as Cheyenne. "Henry," she said suddenly, surprising herself with her boldness. He looked up from his work. "Yes." The question that had been forming in her mind died on her lips. Instead, she said, "Thank you for everything." His eyes held hers for a long moment. "You've nothing to thank me for, Katherine. Any decent man would have done the same." "We both know that's not true," she replied softly. "Not everyone would have taken in strangers, risked their life in a blizzard, shared their supplies without complaint." A hint of color touched his cheeks, and he looked away. "Well, you and Emma, you make the cabin feel like a home again." The simple honesty of his words caught her off guard. Before she could respond, Emma finished nursing and began to fuss. Katherine adjusted her clothing and rose to walk the baby, pacing the small confines of the cabin until Emma's eyes grew heavy. When she finally settled the infant in the makeshift cradle Henry had constructed from a wooden crate lined with furs, Katherine turned to find him watching her, an expression on his face she couldn't quite decipher. "You're a good mother," he said quietly. Katherine smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. "I'm trying to be. I wish Thomas could have seen her." Henry nodded, understanding in his eyes. "He would be proud of you both." The next morning dawned clear and bright, the sun turning the snow-covered landscape into a sea of diamonds. Henry rose early to prepare for their journey, packing supplies and readying his horse. Katherine watched him move with efficient purpose, her heart growing heavier with each completed task. "Should reach Deadwood by mid-afternoon if the trail's passable," he said, securing a bundle to the saddle. Katherine nodded, holding Emma close as she stood in the doorway of the cabin. "I can't believe the journey's almost over." Henry paused in his work, turning to look at her. "Katherine, he stopped, seeming to struggle with his words. "Yes," she prompted when he didn't continue. He shook his head slightly. "Nothing important. We should get moving before the sun gets too high." The journey to Deadwood was slow but steady. Henry had fashioned a sling for Emma that allowed Katherine to carry her securely against her chest, protected from the cold. He walked alongside the horse, leading it carefully through the deeper drifts, occasionally helping Katherine adjust her position in the saddle. They spoke little during the journey, but the silence between them was comfortable, filled with the crunch of snow beneath boots and hooves, the occasional soft sounds from Emma, and the distant calls of winter birds. As they crested a hill around midday, Deadwood came into view below them, a sprawling collection of wooden buildings nestled in a narrow gulch, smoke rising from dozens of chimneys. Even from a distance, the town had a rough-hewn, temporary quality to it, as though it might be abandoned at a moment's notice if the gold played out. "There it is," Henry said, his voice neutral. "Deadwood." Katherine gazed down at what would be her new home with mixed emotions. Relief at having reached their destination warred with an unexpected sense of loss. "It looks busy." "It is that," Henry agreed, "especially with the new strike up in the northern gulch, brought in another 100 miners last month alone." They continued their descent toward the town, the trail widening and showing signs of recent use. As they drew closer, the sounds of Deadwood reached them, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, shouts from teamsters directing freight wagons, piano music drifting from a saloon despite the early hour. "Your sister's boarding house, do you know where it's located?" Henry asked as they reached the outskirts of town. "Clara wrote that it's on William Street, near the assay office," Katherine replied, trying to orient herself in the unfamiliar surroundings. Henry nodded. "I know the place." "Two-story building with green shutters." "Yes, that sounds right." She mentioned the shutters in her letter. As they made their way through the muddy, crowded Main Street, Katherine was acutely aware of the curious glances directed their way. A woman on horseback with a baby, accompanied by a tall, armed man on foot, was apparently an unusual sight even in a town as diverse as Deadwood. They turned onto William Street, which was somewhat quieter than the main thoroughfare. Halfway down the block stood a well-maintained two-story building with the promised green shutters. A small sign hanging beside the door read, "Taylor Boarding House." Katherine's heart leapt at the sight of her sister's name. They had made it. Against all odds, she and Emma had reached safety. Henry stopped the horse in front of the building, looking up at the neat facade. "This is it," he said, an odd note in his voice. Before Katherine could respond, the front door flew open and a woman rushed out, her blonde hair escaping from its pins, her face alight with disbelief and joy. "Katherine!" Clara cried, rushing toward them. "Oh my God, Katherine!" Henry helped Katherine dismount as Clara reached them, immediately enveloping her sister in a fierce embrace, mindful of the baby between them. "We thought you were dead," Clara sobbed, pulling back to look at Katherine's face. "When you didn't arrive and then the blizzard. James rode out looking for you but had to turn back. We've been sick with worry." "I'm all right," Katherine assured her, tears welling in her own eyes at the reunion. "Thanks to Mr. Xavier here. He found us in the snow after my horse died." Emma was just hours old. Clara turned to Henry, who stood awkwardly holding the horse's reins. "Mr. Xavier, I don't know how to thank you. You saved my sister's life, my niece's life." Henry shifted uncomfortably under her gratitude. "Anyone would have done the same, madam." "Not anyone," Clara insisted, echoing Katherine's words from the night before. "Please, you must come inside. James will want to thank you properly." Henry glanced at Katherine, something unspoken passing between them. "I should see to my horse," he said, "and you ladies have catching up to do." "Nonsense," Clara declared. "James can help with your horse. You'll stay for supper at least." Before Henry could protest further, a tall man with a red beard emerged from the boarding house. James Taylor greeted his sister-in-law with genuine relief, and upon hearing of Henry's role in her rescue, immediately insisted on taking care of his horse and belongings. "We've plenty of room," James said, clapping Henry on the shoulder. "The winter's been hard on everyone, not many travelers these days." Outnumbered, Henry reluctantly allowed himself to be ushered into the boarding house. The interior was warm and inviting, with polished wooden floors and simple but comfortable furnishings. A few men sat in the common room, reading newspapers or playing cards, nodding respectfully as the group entered. Clara immediately took Emma from Katherine, cooing over her niece with tears in her eyes. "She's perfect," she whispered. "Looks just like you did as a baby." Katherine smiled tiredly. "She's strong. Had a fever a few days ago, but a Lakota healer helped us." Clara nodded, her experienced eyes examining the infant. "She seems healthy now. But you look exhausted, Katherine. You need rest, a hot bath, and a proper meal." James had already taken Henry's coat and was pouring him a cup of coffee. "Mr. Xavier, we're in your debt. If there's anything we can do to repay your kindness." Henry shook his head. "No need for that, Mr. Taylor. I did what anyone would do." Katherine caught his eye across the room, a small smile playing at her lips at his repeated refusal to accept praise. He returned the smile briefly before looking away. Clara showed Katherine to a small but clean bedroom on the second floor, helping her settle Emma in a proper cradle that had been prepared for her arrival. "I'll have a bath brought up," Clara said, bustling about the room, unpacking Katherine's meager belongings, "and some clean clothes. You can rest while I look after Emma." Katherine sank onto the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by the events of the past week. "Clara, I don't know what I would have done if Henry hadn't found us. We would have frozen to death out there." Clara sat beside her, taking her hand. "But he did find you." "Providence was watching over you, sister." Katherine nodded, though she wasn't sure if it was Providence or simple luck that had brought Henry Xavier into their lives. Either way, she was grateful beyond words. "He's a good man," she said softly. "He lives all alone in that cabin, miles from anyone." Clara studied her sister's face with knowing eyes. "Is he now?" Katherine felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I just meant that it was fortunate he happened to be riding by." "Hum," Clara hummed, an amused smile playing at her lips. "Well, James will make sure he knows he's welcome to stay as long as he likes." The hot bath that followed was the first real luxury Katherine had experienced in months. She scrubbed away the grime of travel and childbirth, allowing herself to truly relax for the first time since leaving the cabin that morning. By the time she dressed in the clean clothes Clara had provided and made her way downstairs, evening had fallen. The boarding house dining room was lit with oil lamps, creating a warm, inviting atmosphere. Several guests sat at the long table, including Henry, who had apparently been convinced to stay for supper. He had cleaned up as well, his hair still damp from washing, his face freshly shaved. He wore the same clothes, but they had been brushed free of dust and snow. When he saw Katherine enter, he stood, an automatic gesture of respect that made several of the other diners take notice. "Mrs. Taylor," he greeted her formally, "you look rested." "I feel much better, thank you," she replied, equally formal despite the intimacy they had shared in the cabin. "And Emma is sleeping soundly for the first time in days." Clara bustled in from the kitchen, carrying a large pot of stew. "Katherine, come sit. You need to eat properly now that you're nursing." Dinner was a lively affair. The other boarders, 2 miners, a freight driver, and a clerk from the assay office were eager for news from the outside world. Henry, though initially quiet, gradually joined the conversation when the topic turned to the condition of the trails and the weather forecast for the coming weeks. Katherine watched him interact with the others, noticing how his natural reticence gave way to a dry wit that had the table laughing more than once. In this setting, surrounded by people, he seemed both less and more than he had in the isolation of the cabin, less comfortable, perhaps, but more complex. After dinner, as the other guests drifted back to the common room for cards or retired to their rooms, Henry approached Katherine where she stood by the fireplace. "I should be going," he said, his voice low. "It's a long ride back." Katherine looked up at him, dismay tightening her chest. "Tonight, but it's already dark and you must be tired." "I've ridden in worse conditions," he replied, though there was a hint of reluctance in his tone. Clara, overhearing, immediately intervened. "Mr. Xavier, I won't hear of you leaving tonight. It's black as pitch out there and the temperature's dropping. You have a room here for as long as you need it." Henry looked as though he might argue, but James joined his wife, adding his own insistence. "At least stay the night, Xavier. Leave after breakfast if you must." Outnumbered again, Henry acquiesced with a nod. "Much obliged, then." When the others had gone, leaving Katherine and Henry alone by the fire, a curious tension filled the space between them. "Your family is kind," Henry said after a moment. "They're grateful," Katherine corrected. "As am I." Henry stared into the flames, his profile strong in the firelight. "Will you be happy here?" The question surprised her. "I hope so," she answered honestly. "It's not what I planned, but few things in life ever are." "And what did you plan?" he asked, turning to face her. Katherine smiled sadly. "Oh, the usual girlish dreams. A loving husband, a house full of children, a garden in the summer. Thomas and I were going to have all of that." She glanced down at her hands. "Now I just want security for Emma." Henry nodded, understanding in his eyes. "You'll find it." "You're stronger than you know, Katherine Taylor." "Am I?" she asked, suddenly vulnerable. "You survived childbirth alone in a blizzard," he reminded her. "You kept going when most would have given up. Yes, you're strong." His faith in her warmed something deep inside Katherine's chest. "Thank you for saying that." They fell silent again, but it was a comfortable silence, filled with unspoken thoughts and feelings neither was quite ready to voice. "I should check on Emma," Katherine said eventually, though she was reluctant to end their conversation. Henry nodded. "Of course." "And I should get some rest if I'm to leave in the morning." As Katherine turned to go, Henry spoke again. "Katherine," she looked back at him. "Yes." He seemed on the verge of saying something important, but instead simply said, "Sleep well." "You too, Henry," she replied softly. That night, as Katherine lay in the unfamiliar bed listening to Emma's soft breathing beside her, she found her thoughts returning again and again to the quiet cabin in the woods and the man who had saved them both. Morning came too quickly. Katherine rose early, feeding Emma and dressing before making her way downstairs. She found Henry already in the kitchen, helping James carry in firewood while Clara prepared breakfast. "Good morning," Katherine said. Emma cradled in one arm. Henry straightened, his eyes immediately finding hers. "Morning," he replied, a small smile touching his lips before he turned back to his task. Breakfast was a subdued affair. The other guests had already eaten and gone about their business for the day, leaving just the family and Henry at the table. Clara kept the conversation flowing with talk of town news and gossip, but Katherine was acutely aware of Henry's imminent departure. Too soon, the meal was finished, and Henry rose to collect his things. James helped him prepare his horse, loading him with provisions Clara insisted he take. Katherine stood on the porch, watching the men work, Emma sleeping peacefully in her arms. When it was time to leave, Henry approached her, hat in hand. "Mrs. Taylor," he began formally. "Katherine," she corrected him gently. His expression softened. "Katherine, I wish you and Emma all the happiness in the world." "Thank you," she said, fighting back the unexpected tears that threatened. "For everything." He nodded, his eyes lingering on her face as if committing it to memory. Then he looked down at Emma, reaching out to touch her tiny hand with one rough finger. "Goodbye, little one. Grow strong." Clara and James discreetly retreated into the house, leaving them alone for their farewell. "Will you be all right out there?" Katherine asked. "All alone?" A shadow crossed Henry's face. "I've been alone a long time. I'm used to it." "That doesn't answer my question," Katherine persisted. He met her gaze then, and the raw honesty in his eyes took her breath away. "I'll manage," he said simply. "I always do." Katherine wanted to say more, to ask him to stay, to visit, to not disappear from their lives, but the words stuck in her throat. It would be improper, forward, to make such requests of a man she barely knew. And yet, she felt as though she knew Henry Xavier better than many people she had spent years alongside. In the end, she said nothing more, and neither did he. With a final nod, he mounted his horse and rode away, not looking back as he disappeared down William Street. Katherine stood on the porch long after he had gone, until Clara gently led her back inside, out of the cold. The weeks that followed were a blur of adjustment for Katherine. She settled into a routine at the boarding house, helping Clara with the cooking and cleaning while caring for Emma, who grew stronger and more alert each day. James installed a small bell at the front desk, so Katherine could take turns minding the business while Clara rested or ran errands. The boarding house guests were mostly polite, hard-working men who treated Katherine with respect once they learned she was a widow. A few made awkward attempts at courtship, which she gently but firmly rebuffed. She wasn't ready, might never be ready to consider such things again. At least, that's what she told herself. But in quiet moments when Emma was sleeping and the house was still, Katherine found her thoughts straying to a small cabin in the woods and the man who lived there alone. "You're pining," Clara observed bluntly one afternoon as they folded laundry together. "For that cowboy of yours." Katherine nearly dropped the sheet she was folding. "He's not my cowboy." "Hum," Clara hummed skeptically. "That's why you look out the window every time a tall man rides down the street." "I do not," Katherine protested, though the heat in her cheeks betrayed her. Clara set down her folding and faced her sister directly. "Katherine, it's been nearly 2 months. He hasn't come to town once. If you want to see him again, you'll have to do something about it yourself." "Like what?" Katherine asked, exasperated. "Ride out to his cabin alone." "That would be completely improper." "So is mooning around like a lovesick girl," Clara retorted. "Besides, you've already spent a week alone with the man. Propriety is a bit late to the party, don't you think?" "Nothing happened," Katherine insisted, though she felt her face grow even hotter at the implication. Clara's expression softened. "I know that, sister. Henry Xavier strikes me as an honorable man, but something did happen, even if it wasn't that. I can see it in your face whenever his name is mentioned." Katherine sighed, abandoning any pretense. "I don't even know what I feel, Clara. It's too soon after Thomas and Henry. He's different, complicated." "Life is complicated," Clara said wisely, "but it's also short, especially out here." Before Katherine could respond, the bell at the front desk jingled, signaling the arrival of a guest. Clara went to attend to it, leaving Katherine alone with her thoughts. That night, as a spring storm battered the windows of the boarding house, Katherine sat in the rocking chair in her room, nursing Emma and listening to the rain. The weather had finally broken, the last of winter's grip giving way to the muddy reality of spring in the Black Hills. A particularly loud crack of thunder startled Emma, causing her to pull away from Katherine's breast with a cry of alarm. "Hush, little one," Katherine soothed, rocking gently. "It's just the storm. Remember how safe we were in Henry's cabin during the blizzard. We're even safer here." At the mention of Henry's name, Emma's cries subsided slightly. Katherine smiled, wondering if her daughter somehow remembered the man who had helped save her life. "He was kind, wasn't he?" Katherine murmured, more to herself than to Emma. "Quiet but kind, and brave. I wish you could know him better." The thought sparked something in Katherine's mind. Why shouldn't Emma know Henry? Why shouldn't she herself know him better? Clara was right. Life in the Dakota Territory was uncertain and often brief. Waiting for propriety's sake seemed foolish in the face of that reality. By morning, Katherine had made a decision. After breakfast, she approached James as he worked on repairing a broken chair in the workshop behind the boarding house. "James, I need to ask a favor," she began. He looked up from his work, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Of course, Katherine. What do you need?" "I want to visit Henry Xavier," she said, the directness of her own words surprising her. "Would you be willing to take me to his cabin?" James's eyebrows rose, but to his credit, he didn't immediately dismiss the idea. "May I ask why?" Katherine had prepared for this question. "Emma and I owe him our lives. I'd like to thank him properly, and—" She hesitated before deciding on honesty. "And I'd like him to see how well Emma is doing. I think it would mean something to him." James studied her face for a long moment. "Clara put you up to this, didn't she?" Katherine smiled. "Clara offered her opinion, as she always does, but the decision is mine." He nodded, returning to his work. "I'll take you next week. Got a delivery of supplies coming in that I need to be here for, but after that we can make the journey. It's about half a day's ride each way, so we'd need to stay overnight." Relief flooded through Katherine. "Thank you, James. I appreciate it more than I can say." James looked up at her again, his expression serious. "Katherine, I don't mean to pry, but are you sure about this? Xavier seems like a good man, but he's chosen to live apart from folks for a reason." "I'm not sure of anything," Katherine admitted, "but I need to see him again, to understand." "To understand what?" James prompted gently when she trailed off. Katherine shook her head. "I'm not entirely certain, perhaps to understand myself." James nodded, accepting her answer. "Next week, then. We'll leave at first light on Wednesday." The days leading up to Wednesday passed with excruciating slowness for Katherine. She tried to occupy herself with work around the boarding house, with caring for Emma, with anything that would keep her mind off the impending visit. But her thoughts continually returned to Henry, wondering how he would receive them, what she would say when she saw him again. Finally, Wednesday arrived. Katherine rose before dawn, dressing carefully in her best traveling dress, a simple blue cotton that Clara had helped her make during the long winter evenings. Emma, now almost 3 months old, was alert and cheerful as Katherine bundled her into warm clothes and a soft blanket. Clara hugged her sister tightly before they departed. "Follow your heart," she whispered in Katherine's ear, "and don't come back until you know what you want." James had hitched the wagon and loaded it with supplies ostensibly as gifts for Henry, but Katherine suspected they were also preparing for any eventuality on the trail. Spring in the Black Hills could be unpredictable, with sudden storms or swollen creeks making travel difficult. The journey was pleasant, despite Katherine's nervous anticipation. The hills were coming alive with new growth, patches of wildflowers dotting the meadows, birds calling from the pines. James kept up a steady stream of conversation, telling stories of his and Clara's early days in Deadwood, of the characters who passed through the boarding house, of his plans for expanding the business if the town continued to grow. Katherine listened with half an ear, her mind racing ahead to the cabin in the clearing and the man who lived there. What would she say to him? What if he didn't want to see her? What if he had only helped them out of duty, not out of any real connection? By mid-afternoon, James slowed the wagon as they approached a familiar clearing. Katherine's heart leapt into her throat at the sight of the small log cabin, smoke rising from the chimney, a horse grazing peacefully in the lean-to stable. "That's it," she said unnecessarily, her voice barely above a whisper. James guided the wagon to a stop a respectful distance from the cabin. The door remained closed, but Katherine felt certain that Henry was aware of their arrival. Nothing went unnoticed in the wilderness. "Do you want me to come with you?" James asked, his hand on the brake. Katherine shook her head. "No, I need to do this myself." She looked down at Emma sleeping peacefully in her arms. "We need to do this ourselves," James nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I'll wait here. Take your time." Katherine climbed down from the wagon with James's assistance, adjusting Emma in her arms. Taking a deep breath to steady her nerves, she walked toward the cabin, her steps slow but determined. Before she could knock, the door swung open and Henry stood there, his expression a mixture of shock and something else, something that made Katherine's heart beat faster. "Katherine," he said, her name sounding like both a question and an answer on his lips. "Hello, Henry," she replied, summoning a smile despite her nervousness. "I hope we're not intruding." He shook his head, seeming to recover from his surprise. "No, no, of course not." His eyes dropped to the bundle in her arms. "Is that Emma?" Katherine confirmed, adjusting the blanket so he could see the baby's face. "She's grown quite a bit since you last saw her." A smile transformed Henry's features, erasing the lines of solitude that had etched themselves there. "She has," he agreed, his voice soft with wonder. "She looks strong." "She is," Katherine said proudly. "Thanks to you." Henry stepped back, gesturing for her to enter the cabin. "Please come in, it's not much, but—" "It's exactly as I remember it," Katherine said as she stepped inside, memories washing over her, the warmth of the fire, the simple comfort of the furnishings, the sense of safety she had felt here despite their precarious situation. Henry moved about the small space, clearing a place for her to sit, putting a kettle on the fire for tea. His movements were less sure than she remembered, as though her presence had disrupted the careful routine of his solitary life. "James brought me," Katherine explained, nodding toward the wagon visible through the window. "He's waiting outside. I hope you don't mind that we came unannounced." Henry paused in his preparations. "No," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't mind." Katherine sat in the chair he offered, cradling Emma, who had awakened and was looking around with curious eyes. "I wanted to see you," she said simply, deciding that honesty was the only approach that made sense. "To thank you properly for what you did for us." Henry sat across from her, his large frame making the small cabin seem even smaller. "There's no need for thanks, Katherine." "There is," she insisted. "You saved our lives, Henry. You opened your home to strangers, shared your supplies, risked your life in a blizzard to find help when Emma was sick. Those aren't small things." He looked uncomfortable with her praise, just as he had in Deadwood. "Anyone would have—" "Don't," Katherine interrupted gently. "Don't say anyone would have done the same. We both know that's not true." Henry met her gaze, something vulnerable in his blue eyes. "Why are you really here, Katherine?" The directness of his question caught her off guard, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Henry Xavier had never been one to dance around a subject. "I don't know," she admitted, her heart pounding. "I just know that I've thought about you every day since you left Deadwood, about this cabin, about how I felt while we were here." "And how did you feel?" he asked, his voice low. Katherine looked down at Emma, gathering courage from her daughter's innocent face. "Safe," she whispered. "For the first time since Thomas died, I felt safe. And not alone." When she looked up again, Henry was watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I've thought about you too," he confessed. "Both of you. The cabin feels empty now." The admission hung in the air between them, fraught with possibility. Katherine felt as though they were standing on the edge of something vast and unknown, terrifying and exhilarating all at once. "Henry," she began, not entirely sure what she was going to say next. The cabin door opened abruptly, cutting off her words. James stood in the doorway, his expression apologetic but urgent. "Katherine, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's weather coming in from the north. We need to head back now if we're going to make it before the storm hits." Henry immediately stood, moving to the window to look at the sky. "He's right," he confirmed, his jaw tight with concern. "Those clouds are moving fast. Spring storm. Could be bad." Katherine felt a rush of disappointment, but Emma's safety had to come first. "We should go, then," she said, rising from her chair. Henry nodded, though she thought she saw a flash of regret in his eyes. "I'll help you get back to the wagon." James retreated to prepare the horses while Henry gathered a few items: extra blankets, some food from his stores. "Just in case," he explained as he packed them into a satchel. At the door, Katherine paused, turning to face him. "I'm sorry we couldn't stay longer," she said, frustration evident in her voice despite her efforts to hide it. Henry's expression softened. "So am I," he replied simply. She searched his face, looking for some sign of what he was thinking, feeling. "Henry, you should go," he interrupted gently, "before the storm hits." Katherine nodded, disappointment a physical ache in her chest. She moved toward the door, then stopped, making a sudden decision. Turning back, she stood on tiptoe and pressed a quick, soft kiss to his cheek. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Before he could respond, she hurried out to the waiting wagon, climbing aboard with James's assistance. Henry followed, handing up the satchel of supplies. "Safe journey," he said, his eyes meeting Katherine's one last time. "Goodbye, Henry," she replied, forcing a smile despite the tears threatening to fall. As James turned the wagon around, Katherine looked back at the cabin and the man standing before it. He raised a hand in farewell, a solitary figure against the darkening sky, and then they were moving away, back toward Deadwood and away from the life that might have been. The storm caught them halfway back to town, just as the sun was beginning to set. Rain poured from the sky in sheets, turning the trail to mud and making progress painfully slow. James fought to keep the horses on the increasingly treacherous path, while Katherine huddled in the back of the wagon with Emma, using her body to shield the baby from the worst of the wind and rain despite the canvas cover. "We need to find shelter." James called over his shoulder, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. "Can't make it back to town in this." Katherine nodded, though she doubted he could see her in the gathering darkness. She clutched Emma tighter, grateful for Henry's foresight in providing extra blankets. The baby, remarkably, seemed unbothered by the storm, sleeping peacefully despite the rocking of the wagon and the crash of thunder overhead. A flash of lightning illuminated a structure ahead, a small line shack used by cattle drovers during roundup. James guided the exhausted horses toward it, relief evident in the set of his shoulders. The shack was little more than 4 walls and a roof, with a small stove in one corner and a couple of rough bunks built into the wall. It was dry, though, and would provide shelter from the worst of the storm. "We'll wait it out here," James decided, helping Katherine and Emma inside before seeing to the horses. "Should pass by morning." Katherine settled onto one of the bunks, unwrapping Emma to check that she was still dry and warm. The baby opened her eyes briefly, regarded her mother solemnly, then drifted back to sleep. James returned, soaked to the skin but satisfied that the horses were as comfortable as possible under the circumstances. "Brought in your bag and the supplies Xavier gave us," he said, setting them down. "Good thing he did. Man knows his weather out here." Katherine nodded, a lump forming in her throat at the mention of Henry. "Yes, he does. James busied himself with starting a small fire in the stove, tactfully ignoring the tears that had begun to slip down Catherine's cheeks. When the shack had warmed somewhat, he sat on the other bunk, regarding his sister-in-law thoughtfully. "Want to talk about it?" he asked gently. Catherine wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "There's nothing to talk about. We barely had a chance to speak before the storm came." James hummed noncommittally. "Seemed to me you said plenty with that kiss, though." Catherine felt her face flush hot despite the chill in the shack. "You saw that. Hard not to," James replied with a small smile. "Don't worry, I won't tell Clara. She'd never let you hear the end of it." Despite herself, Catherine laughed. "She wouldn't, would she? She's been half convinced I'm in love with him since the day he left Deadwood." "And are you?" James asked, his tone carefully neutral. Catherine looked down at Emma, sleeping peacefully in her arms. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "How can I be? I barely know him, and it's only been a few months since Thomas." "Time doesn't always matter as much as we think it does," James observed. "Especially out here. Life moves differently on the frontier." "But it's not just about me anymore," Catherine said, brushing a finger over Emma's soft cheek. "I have to think of her future, her security. Henry lives alone in the wilderness, miles from anyone. What kind of life would that be for a child?" James considered this. "The same kind of life thousands of children are living right now across the West," he pointed out. "It's not an easy life, but it can be a good one. And Xavier strikes me as a man who would move mountains to protect those he cares about." Catherine couldn't argue with that assessment. She had seen firsthand how far Henry would go to protect her and Emma. "I just don't know what to do," she confessed. "Part of me wants to go back to that cabin tomorrow and tell him how I feel. But another part is terrified. What if he doesn't want a ready-made family? What if I'm imagining this connection between us?" "You won't know unless you ask him," James said simply. "And from what I saw today, I don't think you're imagining anything." Catherine thought about Henry's admission that he had thought about them, that the cabin felt empty without them. Was that enough to build a future on? "Get some sleep," James suggested, seeing the exhaustion written on her face. "Things often look clearer in the morning." Catherine nodded, stretching out on the narrow bunk with Emma nestled securely beside her. Despite her tumultuous thoughts, the exhaustion of the day soon pulled her into a deep sleep. She dreamed of the cabin in the clearing, of Henry's steady presence, of a life built together in the wilderness. In the dream, Emma was older, running through a meadow of wildflowers, her laughter carrying on the breeze. Henry stood beside Catherine, his arm around her waist, watching their daughter with pride and love in his eyes. The dream was so vivid, so real that when Catherine awoke to the sound of voices outside the shack, she felt momentarily disoriented. The storm had passed, sunlight streaming through the small window. Emma was beginning to stir beside her, making the little noises that signaled hunger. James was already up, stoking the fire in the stove. He glanced over at Catherine. "Morning. Storm's blown over, but we've got visitors." Before Catherine could ask who, the door to the shack opened and Henry Xavier stepped inside, removing his hat as he ducked through the low doorway. "Xavier," James greeted him. "Didn't expect to see you this morning." Henry nodded in acknowledgement, but his eyes immediately sought out Catherine and Emma on the bunk. "When the storm hit, I was concerned," he explained. "Thought you might need help getting back to town." Catherine sat up, adjusting her clothing and hair, suddenly acutely aware of her appearance after a night in the lined shack. "Henry," she said, her voice still rough with sleep. "You rode out in the storm, after it passed," he corrected. "First light." James looked between them, a knowing smile playing at his lips. "I'll check on the horses," he said, making a tactful exit. Alone with Henry, Catherine felt her heart begin to race. He stood just inside the door, his hat in his hands, uncertainty written across his features despite his imposing size. "You didn't have to come," Katherine said softly. "We would have been fine." "I know," Henry replied, "but I couldn't stay at the cabin knowing you were out in this." He gestured vaguely toward the window, indicating the aftermath of the storm. Katherine smiled, something warm unfurling in her chest at his concern. "Thank you for coming to check on us." He nodded, his eyes never leaving her face. "Katherine, yesterday, before the storm came, there were things I wanted to say." "Me too," she admitted, her pulse quickening. Henry took a step closer, then stopped, as if uncertain of his welcome. "I'm not good with words," he said, frustration evident in his voice. "Never have been." "Then don't use them," Katherine suggested, gathering her courage. "Show me instead." For a moment, Henry stood perfectly still, processing her words. Then he moved forward with purpose, crossing the small space until he stood directly before her. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he reached out and cupped her face in his large hand. Katherine leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly at the tenderness in his gesture. When she opened them again, Henry was watching her with such raw emotion that it took her breath away. "I've been alone a long time," he said, his voice rough. "Thought I preferred it that way. But then you and Emma came into my life, and suddenly the cabin feels too empty without you there." "Henry," Katherine whispered, her heart threatening to burst from her chest. "I know it's too soon," he continued. "I know you're still grieving Thomas, and I know I don't have much to offer a woman like you. But if you could see your way to giving me a chance, I swear I would spend every day trying to deserve you. Both of you." Tears welled in Katherine's eyes at the sincerity in his words. "You already deserve us," she said, reaching up to cover his hand with her own. "You saved our lives. You opened your home and your heart to us when we had nowhere else to go." "That wasn't charity," Henry said firmly. "From the moment I found you in that snow, something changed for me. I can't explain it, but it feels like you were meant to be there. Like I was meant to find you." Katherine smiled through her tears. "Maybe we were." Emma chose that moment to make her presence known, her hungry cries filling the small shack. Katherine laughed softly, breaking the intensity of the moment. "Someone has opinions about this conversation," she said, lifting Emma into her arms. Henry stepped back, giving her space to attend to the baby, but his eyes remained on them both, a mixture of wonder and longing in his expression. "She's beautiful," he said quietly, "like her mother." Katherine felt a blush rise to her cheeks at the compliment. "Would you like to hold her while I prepare to feed her?" Henry looked momentarily terrified at the prospect, then nodded, holding out his arms. Katherine placed Emma in them, showing him how to support her head. The contrast between his large, weathered hands and Emma's tiny form was striking, yet there was nothing awkward about the way he held her, as if his body remembered from when he had cared for his younger siblings so many years ago. "Hello, little one," he murmured to the baby. "You've grown so much." Emma's cries subsided as she stared up at him with curious eyes, seemingly recognizing the deep voice that had been part of her earliest days. Katherine watched them together, her heart full to bursting. In that moment, she knew with absolute certainty what she wanted, what she needed. "Henry," she said, drawing his attention back to her, "ask me again." He looked confused for a moment, then understanding dawned in his eyes. Still cradling Emma carefully, he stepped closer to Katherine. "Come back with me," he said simply. "Not just for a visit. Come home with me, you and Emma. Let me take care of you both." "Yes," Katherine replied without hesitation. "Yes, we'll come home with you." The smile that broke across Henry's face transformed him completely, erasing the years of solitude and hardship in an instant. He leaned forward, careful of the baby between them, and pressed his lips to hers in a gentle, questioning kiss. Katherine responded with all the emotion she had been holding back, her hand coming up to rest against his chest, feeling the strong, steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. When they parted, Henry rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as if savoring the moment. "I never thought I'd have this," he confessed quietly. "A family of my own." "Neither did I," Katherine admitted. "Not after Thomas died, but sometimes life gives us second chances when we least expect them." The door opened and James stepped back into the shack, taking in the scene before him with a knowing smile. "I take it we've had a change of plans." Katherine looked to Henry, then back to her brother-in-law. "Yes," she confirmed. "Emma and I won't be returning to Deadwood, not to stay anyway." James nodded, unsurprised. "Clara will be disappointed to lose her help at the boarding house, but she won't be surprised either. She's been predicting this since the day Xavier rode out of town." Henry handed Emma back to Katherine, his expression growing serious. "Mr. Taylor, I want you to know that I intend to provide for Katherine and Emma to the best of my ability. I may not have much, but I'll work twice as hard to make sure they want for nothing." James clasped Henry's shoulder. "I believe you will, Xavier. But you should know that Katherine comes with a dowry of sorts. Clara and I set aside some money from Thomas's mining shares that came through after his death. It's not a fortune, but it's enough to make a good start." Katherine looked up in surprise. "You never mentioned any mining shares." "We were waiting for the right time," James explained. "Seems like now is that time." Henry shook his head. "I don't need money to take care of them." "No," James agreed, "but it might help you build a proper home for them. That cabin of yours is fine for a solitary man, but a growing family needs room." Henry glanced at Katherine, a question in his eyes. She smiled and nodded, silently encouraging him to accept the unexpected gift. "Thank you," Henry said finally. "I'd be grateful for any help in making a good home for them." "Good," James said, satisfied. "Now, let's get back to Deadwood so you two can break the news to Clara, and perhaps visit the preacher while we're at it." Henry looked at Katherine, uncertainty flickering across his face. "Is that what you want?" he asked quietly. To be married so soon, Katherine considered the question seriously. It was quick, perhaps too quick by the standards of polite society, but they weren't in polite society. They were on the frontier, where life moved at a different pace and second chances were rare and precious. "Yes," she said decisively. "I don't want to wait. Life is too uncertain out here to waste time on conventions." Relief and joy washed over Henry's face. "Then I'd be honored to make you my wife, Katherine Taylor, if you'll have me." "I will," she replied simply, sealing her promise with another kiss. They were married 3 days later in the small church in Deadwood, with Clara and James as witnesses, and Emma swaddled in a new blanket made by the women of the town. Katherine wore a simple ivory dress that Clara had helped her alter, and Henry had purchased a new shirt for the occasion, looking uncomfortable but handsome in his formal attire. The ceremony was brief, the preacher clearly used to frontier weddings that valued practicality over pomp. When he pronounced them man and wife, Henry kissed Katherine with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes and applause from the small gathering of well-wishers that had assembled. "Mrs. Xavier," he murmured against her lips, testing the sound of her new name. "Mrs. Xavier," she repeated, smiling up at him. "I like the sound of that." They spent one last night at the boarding house, in a room Clara had specially prepared for them, with Emma in a cradle beside the bed. In the privacy of their room, they came together as husband and wife, their passion tempered by tenderness, each discovery a revelation. Afterward, as they lay entwined beneath the quilts, Henry traced patterns on Catherine's bare shoulder with gentle fingers. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, a hint of vulnerability in his voice. "About me. About living so far from town." Katherine propped herself up on one elbow, looking down at his face in the moonlight streaming through the window. "I've never been more sure of anything," she assured him. "The cabin already feels more like home than anywhere I've been since leaving my parents' house." Henry smiled, pulling her down for another kiss. "It won't always be easy," he warned. "Winters are hard, spring brings floods, summer brings heat and drought. And there's always the risk of sickness, accidents." "Life is always a risk," Katherine reminded him, "but it's better faced together than alone." He couldn't argue with that logic. Instead, he gathered her closer, his strong arms creating a haven of warmth and security that Katherine had thought she might never find again after Thomas's death. "I love you," Henry whispered into the darkness, the words sounding as though they had been dragged from some deep place within him. "I think I have since I found you in that snow." Catherine's heart swelled with joy. "And I love you," she replied, the truth of the words resonating through her entire being. "You and the life we're going to build together." The next morning, they loaded their belongings into Henry's wagon, a wedding gift from James and Clara, along with a team of strong horses. The dowry money was safely tucked away, to be used for expanding the cabin and purchasing supplies for their new life together. Clara hugged her sister tightly as they prepared to leave. "I'll miss you," she said, tears in her eyes. "But I'm happy for you. Henry is a good man." "He is," Katherine agreed, watching as her new husband gently placed Emma in the specially padded basket they had prepared for her in the wagon. "And he'll be a wonderful father to Emma." "You'll bring her to visit often?" Clara asked, though it sounded more like a command than a question. Katherine laughed. "Of course. And you and James will always be welcome at our home." With final hugs and promises to visit, they set off, leaving Deadwood behind as they headed toward the small cabin that would be their home at least until they could build something larger for their growing family. The journey back to the cabin was filled with plans and dreams. Henry wanted to add another room to the existing structure, plant a vegetable garden come spring, perhaps add some chickens and a milk cow. Katherine suggested a small flower garden near the door, shelves for the books she had brought with her, perhaps even a school room eventually where she could teach Emma and any other children who might come along. "Other children?" Henry asked, a slow smile spreading across his face. Katherine blushed but met his gaze steadily. "If you want them. I always dreamed of a large family." Henry's expression grew tender as he reached across to take her hand. "I want whatever makes you happy, Katherine. And yes, I'd like more children. Children of our own, though Emma will always be as much mine as any we might have together." The simple certainty in his voice brought tears to Katherine's eyes. "Thank you for that," she whispered, "for loving her as your own." "How could I not?" Henry replied. "She's part of you. And she's the reason I found you in that snow. If she hadn't decided to arrive early, you might have made it to Deadwood without incident, and we might never have met." Katherine hadn't considered that perspective before. "Perhaps we have her to thank for bringing us together then." "I believe we do," Henry agreed, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. "And I'll spend the rest of my life being grateful for that gift." When they finally reached the clearing and the small cabin came into view, Katherine felt a surge of emotion. This was home now, her home, their home. A place where they would build a life together, raise their children, face the challenges and joys that the frontier would bring their way. Henry helped her down from the wagon, then carefully lifted Emma from her basket. Together, they walked to the cabin door, pausing on the threshold. "Welcome home, Mrs. Xavier," Henry said, his voice rough with emotion. Katherine smiled up at her husband, her heart full to bursting with love and hope for their future. "It's good to be home," she replied, standing on tiptoe to kiss him as they crossed the threshold together. A family at last. 5 years later, Henry Xavier stood in the doorway of their expanded cabin, watching as Henry taught their son Thomas how to groom the gentle mare they kept for riding into town. At 4 years old, Thomas was the spitting image of his father, with the same serious blue eyes and quiet determination. Emma, now 5 and a half, sat on the porch beside her mother, carefully stitching a sampler with her small, nimble fingers. Her dark hair was plaited into neat braids, her face a perfect blend of Catherine's features and memories of the father she had never known. "Papa is patient with Tommy," Emma observed, looking up from her needlework. "He never gets angry when Tommy does it wrong." Katherine smiled, resting a hand on her swollen belly where their third child grew. "Your papa understands that learning takes time and practice. He's a good teacher." Emma nodded solemnly. "And a good papa." "The very best," Katherine agreed, watching as Henry lifted Thomas onto his shoulders, the boys' delighted laughter carrying across the yard. Their life wasn't easy frontier living, never was, but it was rich in ways that couldn't be measured in gold or dollars. The cabin had grown along with their family, now boasting 3 proper bedrooms, a larger kitchen, and a small schoolroom where Katherine taught not only their children but several others from nearby homesteads. Henry had proven to be a devoted husband and father, working tirelessly to provide for his family while never missing the small, important moments of their children's lives. He read to them each night, taught them to respect the land and its bounty, showed them by example what it meant to be honorable and kind. And his love for Katherine had only deepened with each passing year, each challenge faced together, each joy shared. As if sensing her thoughts, Henry looked up, meeting her gaze across the yard. The smile that lit his face was still the same one that had warmed her heart that first night in the cabin, when he had built a fire and told her to stay close. She had stayed close ever since, and in doing so had found a love and a life beyond anything she could have imagined when she set out from Cheyenne all those years ago, alone and afraid with an unborn child. "I love you," Henry mouthed across the distance, Thomas still perched happily on his shoulders. "I love you too," Katherine replied, her hand moving in small circles over her belly as their unborn child kicked vigorously. She had been stranded once, alone with a newborn in the snow. But a cowboy had built a fire and told her to stay close. She had, and in doing so, had found not just safety but a love that would last a lifetime.